All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We love to explore all sorts of hidden corners of thought here, and today's subject is one that has a certain mystique around it. We're going to be talking about applied magic. And I know what you might be thinking, but this is not about pulling rabbits out of hats or casting spells to make your enemies disappear.
Right. It's not about stage illusions or fantasy novels. It's really more of a practical philosophy,
Mhm.
a way of looking at the world and understanding the forces that shape it, forces that might not be immediately obvious.
Exactly. Our source material dives deep into the occult, but not in a spooky Halloween kind of way. It's more about using these occult principles, these
Mhm.
sort of hidden laws of nature, to understand and navigate reality itself. It's almost like a user manual for a level of reality we don't usually even see.
And, our source even talks about two different paths to spiritual understanding, which I thought was fascinating. There's the mystic way, which is all about renouncing the world, detaching from the material, to ultimately merge with some sort of universal essence.
Mm.
It's a path of letting go.
But then there's the occult way, which is the path we're going to focus on today. This is about engaging with the world, mastering the art of manifested existence, really aiming for complete self-realization. It's not about escaping life, but becoming a master of life.
Yeah, and I like how our source doesn't present these two paths as being in opposition. It's not like one is right and one is wrong. They're both valid ways of approaching spiritual growth, just with different focuses, one on the unmanifest and one on the manifest.
Right. So let's talk more about this occult way. It's not about dominating or controlling the world, but more like becoming a virtuoso of life, understanding its intricacies like a musician understands their instrument.
Precisely. It's about bringing things into harmony, into equilibrium. It's about drawing out the full potential that's already there, not imposing your will on things.
So the master of the temple in this framework isn't some kind of tyrant or dictator, right? They're more like a conductor, guiding the orchestra of creation. They're a servant of evolution, bringing order and balance to the creative forces.
Yeah, they're interpreting a deeper wisdom and trying to help us understand it too.
And that really speaks to this fundamental human desire to understand the world, right?
Yeah.
To make sense of it all. It's not just about enduring life, it's about mastering it through insight.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the practical side of occultism, which I think a lot of people are curious about. And our source actually suggests that these ideas are becoming more and more accessible. Historically, occultism was shrouded in secrecy, but now it's like some of that veil is lifting.
Well, and there's this really interesting analogy our source uses to explain occult training. It's like a gymnast training for the Olympics. Most of us aren't going to be competing at that level, but we can still benefit from the basic exercises.
Yeah, those foundational principles, those exercises for the mind, can help us all become more resilient, more adaptable in our daily lives. It's like strengthening your mental muscles.
And it's fascinating to look at this in the context of what was happening at the time. Occultism was emerging alongside things like spiritualism and Christian Science in the late 19th century. And our source suggests that occultism was trying to provide a scientific basis for some of the things these other movements were experiencing.
Right. Spiritualism was all about communicating with spirits. Christian Science focused on the healing power of faith. And occultism came along saying, hey, maybe there are underlying principles we can understand that can explain these phenomena.
It's like moving beyond just knowing that a lever works to understanding the physics behind why it works.
And beyond just explaining things, our source also suggests that esoteric doctrines can provide a clue to the meaning of life. It can give us a sense of context, of purpose, a feeling of belonging to a larger whole.
Instead of feeling like a leaf being blown in the wind, you start to see the patterns in the wind.
Exactly. And some of these occult concepts offer some really thought-provoking perspectives on life's big questions. For example, reincarnation. It's not just a single shot at eternity, but a process of learning and growth over multiple lifetimes, which honestly feels more reasonable to me.
Yeah, it makes you think about the bigger picture. And then there's this idea of invisible planes of existence, the idea that our physical world is not all there is. These other realms are like the source of the forces that animate life. It reminds me of Emile Coué and his work with positive affirmations. He might have been tapping into those forces somehow.
Yeah, it's like there are these currents running through reality that we can learn to work with, to harmonize with. It's not about trying to dominate nature, but understanding its rhythms and working with them, like a sailor who understands the tides.
And that brings us to karma. Often it's seen as this simple cosmic reward and punishment system, but our source presents it as something much more nuanced. It's about learning an adjustment over multiple lifetimes, gaining spiritual values, and ultimately achieving a kind of equilibrium.
Yeah, it's not just about getting what you deserve in this life, but about the whole arc of your soul's journey. And our source even talks about looking at things in the light of three lives to really grasp the scope of cause and effect.
That's deep stuff. And then there's this concept that really blew my mind. The idea that our thoughts create thought forms which can attract corresponding forces. It's like our thoughts have real weight and can shape reality.
Which is both empowering and a little scary, right? It shows the power of the mind, but also its limitations, which is something that Kabbalah explores in depth. It's a whole map of consciousness.
So our source even suggests applying these occult principles to things like sociology, prisons, asylums, medicine, really looking at the whole person, not just the physical body, but the emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects as well.
Imagine approaching societal issues with that kind of holistic understanding. It could be revolutionary. And, our source also talks about this waning need for secrecy in occultism. While it's important to safeguard some of the more powerful techniques from misuse, there's value in sharing the basic principles.
Right. It's about responsible knowledge, not keeping everything hidden away.
Exactly. And then our source delves into the nature of reality itself, suggesting that there are actually three different kinds: physical, psychic, and spiritual.
Okay, so the physical world, that's the one we experience with our senses, right? But then there's the psychic reality, which our source describes as the totality of all realizations achieved by consciousness. It's like a vast, interconnected network of understanding.
And underlying all of this is spiritual reality, the unmanifest source of everything, the great unmanifest.
But the key takeaway here is that our mental power, our ability to influence reality with our thoughts, operates within the psychic realm. That's where things like Christian Science and New Thought have their effect.
But there's a catch. Even those psychic realizations can be inaccurate, incomplete, and that can lead to what our source calls positive evil. Just because we believe something strongly doesn't make it true.
So then we get into this really intriguing category of non-humans. And I just want to be clear, we're not talking about aliens and spaceships here. We're talking about sentient intelligences that aren't currently in human bodies.
Right. So that includes things like discarnate spirits, but also more advanced beings like masters and interplane adepti.
And our source acknowledges all those historical and cultural stories about encounters with these beings. There's a saying, there's no smoke without fire.
And esoteric science actually suggests that there are other lines of evolution happening, beings that don't exist in space and time the way we do. They're in different modes of consciousness that interpenetrate our own reality.
So it's like layers of existence, all coexisting. And according to our source, there are a few ways that contact with these beings can happen. It could be through altered states of consciousness or through those materializing mediums, the ones who can produce ectoplasm.
And of course, there's intentional magical invocation by those who are trained in these practices.
Right. And the types of non-humans are really diverse. There are the living dead, which are basically the personalities of deceased humans. Those are the folks that spiritualism tends to focus on. Then there are elemental beings, which are different in kind from humans. They don't have the same divine spark. They're formed from coordinated actions and reactions like the forces of nature.
Yeah, like nature spirits, divas. And even the idea of a bee angel, representing the hive mind of a bee colony.
And then there are the angelic beings, those great archons, the building spirits of the universe. They've never had a physical incarnation. And then you have thought forms, which are like artificial elementals created by human consciousness.
And then, of course, there are the Qfoth, which dwell in the realm of unbalanced force. Those are the ones often associated with the demonic.
But it's important to remember, these non-humans aren't simply good or evil. Like us, they're on a journey of evolution.
Exactly. And even when dealing with the Qliphoth, the Adept's approach isn't to curse them or destroy them. It's about restoring balance. The Tree of Life is like a map for understanding and navigating these realms.
So why would anyone want to contact these forces in the first place? Well, our source says it could be for healing souls or for intensifying one's own nature for specific work.
Yeah, or for undertaking specific magical operations. But it's important to remember that genuine communication with these beings is rare, and haphazard contact can be very dangerous.
Not something to be taken lightly. And that brings us to black magic, a topic that often gets sensationalized. Our source makes an important distinction here. It's not about the techniques being different from white magic. It's about the intention of the operator.
Right, and the symbolism used and the powers being contacted, the same principles and training apply to both. It's like You can have a conductor who leads a symphony orchestra and one who leads a jazz band. They both use the same basic skills, but the results are very different.
So even seemingly dark symbols and powers can be used legitimately depending on the circumstances. It's like a surgeon who has to take risks to save a life.
But there are certain things that our source identifies as inherently problematic. Public display of certain magical methods, for example, because it tends to arouse those baser instincts. And techniques involving sex and blood are ethically complex and can be dangerous.
And then, of course, there's deliberate evocation of evil forces, often for revenge or just for the sadistic pleasure of inflicting pain. And invoking those primal natural forces without proper understanding is a recipe for disaster.
And then there's this interesting concept of gray magic.
Mm.
These are operations done out of ignorance or just for the thrill of it, without regard for those underlying cosmic laws.
And that can easily slip into black magic, right? The key, according to our source, is whether you're aligned with those cosmic laws. White magic aligns, gray magic disregards, and black magic intentionally defies.
So working with those ancient pagan gods, for example, could be beneficial if done with understanding and respect. It's like getting spiritual vitamins.
But dabbling in seances and fortune-telling just to satisfy your curiosity, without considering the potential spiritual consequences, that's heading into gray magic territory. And our source suggests that can actually lead to a deterioration of your mind and judgment.
It's about being mindful of the forces you're playing with. And then our discussion moves into this concept of a magical body. This goes beyond just psychic powers. It's about initiation into the astral plane, gaining access to and control over those etheric subplanes, which are like the source of vitality for all living things.
So that's what gives certain people that magnetic quality, right? They're tapped into those reservoirs of energy. And our source mentions the green ray, which is associated with Celtic initiation as being connected to artistic inspiration, the subconscious mind, that creative impulse.
But it's important to balance those astral contacts with the ability to manifest them in the physical world. If you get overwhelmed by those astral influences, it can lead to mental instability.
You have to be grounded. And our source suggests that understanding the astral realm could shed light on certain types of insanity and hallucinations.
Yeah, it can help us distinguish between what's purely psychological and what might be an actual encounter with an astral entity. And looking ahead, this understanding of the astral realm could lead to some major scientific breakthroughs.
Imagine understanding how those astral forces affect dense matter. It could revolutionize things like cancer research or our understanding of the endocrine system.
Absolutely. And then we get into the occult field today. Our source points to the work of S.L. McGregor Mathers and the cipher manuscripts he acquired as being the common source for a lot of modern Western esoteric traditions.
Now, the origin of those manuscripts is still a mystery. Matters claim to have received them from some higher source, but who knows for sure? But the interesting thing is our source emphasizes the practical effectiveness of Mather's system. It's not just theory, it works.
The proofs is in the pudding, as they say. And then there was that whole schism within Mather's organization involving Aleister Crowley, which led to the original group splitting up. But even though it's fragmented, the power of that system is undeniable.
And our source really stresses the importance of those inner plane connections with a legitimate order. It's like the hidden part of the iceberg where the real work happens.
Oh, mundane knowledge and scholarship are important too, for building a functional occult school and for training students.
Right. It's not all just about psychic powers. And the real line of spiritual contact, according to our source, is often a personal one, initiated by a meeting between a seeker and an illuminated teacher.
It's like those pivotal encounters throughout history, like Abraham and Melchizedek or Jesus and John the Baptist. But even with that initial contact, it takes a lot of work to build a lasting system.
Personal dedication, scholarship, and organizational skills. And it's interesting how the weaknesses of a founder can sometimes lead to fissures in their organizations down the line.
Yeah, human nature at work. But ultimately, it's not just about physical continuity. The real lineage is that group mind on the inner planes.
The effectiveness of the work is what validates it. And our source ends on this really compelling point about the importance of literature, of having a sacred book that speaks to intuition and faith.
That's what gives a spiritual movement staying power. And the ultimate goal, it seems, is to create a system that's self-sustaining and independent, based on method rather than rigid doctrine.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into applied magic, it's clear that this is a subject that goes way beyond just rituals and secret societies. It's a whole philosophy for understanding the interconnectedness of reality.
And even if some of these concepts seem a bit out there, the underlying principles really do touch on those fundamental aspects of human experience,
Mhm.
our perceptions, our place in the universe.
And as you go about your day, think about this. What's the interplay between the visible and the invisible in your own life? How might those ideas of psychic reality, thought forms, or even those non-physical intelligences, how might they offer a new perspective on your experiences?
Maybe there's something to be learned from those lost secrets of the mysteries after all, and that's something to ponder.
Thanks for exploring with us. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.